It's my privilege now to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Fethi Mansouri. Professor Mansouri holds the UNESCO Chair in Comparative Research on Cultural Diversity and Social Justice, and also the Alfred Deakin Research Chair in Migration and Intercultural Studies. Professor Mansouri is the director of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. Since 2010, Professor Mansouri has been serving as an expert advisor to the United Nations on Cultural Diversity and Intercultural Relations. Fethi has an extensive publication list, and some of the latest publications include a book on the multicultural challenge, and also another one on interculturalism at the crossroads. It's my privilege to invite to the podium Professor Mansouri.
Let me thank you, Sharon, for those kind words. Let me first start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and future. And let me add a word to that in saying that we are here to discuss social justice, that justice to the indigenous people has not been achieved, and that they have never ceded sovereignty of their land voluntarily, and that as we read and make these acknowledgements to country, we are all fully aware of the implications of these acknowledgements to country. That the pursuit of justice will never be complete till the indigenous people of Australia are also able to have a say in how their land is going to be negotiated with these successive waves of immigrants. Let me also start by thanking the organizing committee for this wonderful conference, and in particular Sharon, Howard, and the team. I can see the team is quite expensive. Dara and others, and Safi. It's the Alfred Deakin Institute, which I have the honor and the privilege of leading, is a very ambitious, very comprehensive social sciences and humanities research institute. We very much look to conduct research that is risky in the way it is pursued, but also ambitious in the way it is conceptualized. And we have a combination of theory-driven research clusters, 4 of them, and I think this particular conference is aligned with one of those themes, but we also have a number of research, what we call research networks, including MESF, which are aimed to really conduct impactful engagement and dissemination activities, including conferences of this type. And this is a very good example. We are very much interested in bringing scholars here to talk and exchange ideas on some of the key issues that are shaping our agenda. And I think there's none more important at this very minute than democratization in the Middle East and foreign policy of the US and how it plays out on the ground across the region. It's interesting talking about democratization. I need to, sorry. So I'm going to be trying to, swing right and left. Not ideologically speaking, but in terms of my positioning. It's interesting, I just came back from Baku. I was telling Sharon, I was in Baku last week, 3 or 4 days, attended the UN forum there and flew back Sunday morning. And Baku, as is the capital of Azerbaijan, of course, is a very interesting case study also, if you want to look at what happens in relation to political transformations. I wouldn't say democratization, but political transformations. And the reason why it is interesting, because I come to all of this stuff. Obviously, you have heard that my primary interest really is intercultural relations and how they drive agendas among peoples, communities, and countries. But my interest has always been much more in civil society than in political institutions. And I look at the civilizing potential of civil society in societies where there is obviously 2 things: when there is autocracy, there is lack of democratization, and when there is potentially a contestation of that notion of power. And I'm very much perhaps more critical of the Weberian approach to civil society, that says, because of lack of industrialization in the Muslim Arab Eastern world, civilization, so to speak, generally speaking, the prospects for gaining the kind of freedoms, the kind of democracy, the kind of openings that Western societies have achieved are not very high, because we are yet to go through equivalent industrialization as Europe did, and we are yet to go through the implications of what an industrialization way would bring culturally, politically, socially. As a matter of fact, some people who use Weber would go as far as saying that the very urban nature of the Muslim city does not allow for that to happen. Because civil society relies on spaces, public spaces, where citizens would gather and they could form groups. Those groups could develop narratives. Those narratives could actually contest, disrupt, and ultimately challenge state authority. So this is the kind of theorizing that's been going on for a while in relation to why the Arab, Muslim / Eastern societies have been very slow to jump onto the democratization wave. Historically speaking, of course, and I'm trying to contextualize a lot because later on I'll go through my slides fairly quickly with you. I didn't mean to do the top like this. I'm not sure why. Okay, well, let's put it over there. So. Okay, thank you, Shah. I can see it. So remember that there's always been a kind of a thinking, deep thinking, from the time of perhaps Alexis de Tocqueville when he went to America, and he was very much inspired by this new nation and what goes on in America. And Alexis, I'm not sure you read his book, I read it in French and also in English, but if you read that book, he kind of predicts that, the verve of American democracy in the mid-19th century meant that it will be universalized. He predicts the universalization of democracy as a system of governing simply because of what it offers to societies. And remember, he was coming from Europe. At that time, Europe wasn't really very much leading that kind of debate. Then fast forward a little bit to the 20th century, both World War I and World War II, where people thought with the defeat of fascism, in particular post-World War II, that what will happen is, now that fascism has been defeated, there is only a Pax Americana, so to speak. There's an American view of how to govern, how to build social contracts, and therefore we are likely to see an emergence of a universal model of how societies are going to be governed. Of course, we know that that wasn't the case. The Soviet bloc emerged, and the American bloc was led by the US model, and even then it had deep problems internally across those who were aligned with that Pax Americana. Fast forward a little bit more, and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course what we heard is, and the end of history theory, we heard that now really is the emergence of one particular model of political governance. Now is the emergence of the triumphant, if you like, Western model to governing societies politically, socially. And of course, at the end of history, dictum did not prove to be correct. That takes us really to what happened with the Arab Spring and where does the Arab Spring sit. And then I will talk about the Tunisian exceptionalism, so to speak, in relative terms. What I would like to talk really in relation to Tunisia and why it kind of remains an exception is from a theory of transition, political transition, and this is really interesting. So when you look at most theories of political transition, what you get is there is a strong emphasis on the experience of both South America and post-Soviet collapse Eastern Europe and the way they transitioned into some form of democratic governance. And this is the failure of sometimes theorizing, a lot of those theories where people were trying to basically import them and apply them in the context of a region, MENA, Middle East and North Africa, which basically and essentially and has absolutely different trajectories, historical trajectories, have different experiences with political governance, and altogether do not really offer kind of a comparable case study in relation to what happened both in South America and post-Soviet Central Europe. So that left a big vacuum. How do we make sense of what's happening? Both in relation to two things. How do we analyze political transition in these countries from a conceptual, epistemological point of view? And then how do we make sense of the divergent trajectories of each of those countries that went through the Arab Spring? So what do we need? So this is what I've been trying to do in my research on Tunisia from a strongly focused civil society perspective, obviously, as I said earlier. So we'll look at that. Hopefully we'll have enough time to share with you. I've got a little bit of historical and theoretical perspectives, but I do have some data to share with you. Some secondary data, but some primary data, which was analyzed just recently following a project I did in Tunisia in 2017. So you'll have some recent data to look at. Of course, all the talk about Arab Spring, political transformations across the countries of the Arab Spring, many people keep referring to this very notion of, but the Arabs, the Muslims, in particular the Arab Muslim societies, are incapable of doing political democratization successfully. There is a democracy deficit, actually, in the way Arab Muslim societies are constructed. And that has historical reasons that I've outlined briefly earlier, but also because of the type of repression that Arab autocratic regimes actually exercised. And let me give you some examples from societies I'm very familiar with. I'm Tunisian background, but to my south, right is Libya, and to my left, if I'm Tunisian, is Algeria. So, and I'm not going to talk about Tunisia because I will focus on it a little later. So Libya, for instance, you see the mess in Libya right now. Complete jungle, competing central governments in different cities. There's a part of Libya which is not even governable because it's dominated, controlled by tribes which have no allegiance to anyone. Why that's happening, why the situation in Libya is the way it is? Well, simply because during the reign of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, the late Muammar Gaddafi, Libyan society never really relied on a constitution, so there's no constitution, never had or allowed political organization or civil organization, so there's no NGOs to speak of in Libya, and really was governed with no structures whatsoever. So it's the supreme leader, the comrade, he's got his little green book, which is full of slogans, and that's how Libya was governed. And how that worked out in Libya and was sustained through these economic distributions of wealth and redistribution. And that brings me to a very important point in theories of transition. Theories of transition say that the societies which are more likely actually to succeed are societies where there should be more social equality and lack of inequalities. Because the more inequalities you have, the redistributive nature of democratization becomes too costly for the elites. You can't have democratization which would redistribute resources and power if that redistribution is going to make those who had power, economic, political, otherwise, be the losers. And this is what you see in the contestation. And this is why, actually, theories of political transition say democratization is a never-ending process. Because negotiating, renegotiating, contesting, disrupting, trying to work out who's going to get what out of this, how we reposition, and this is actually what's happening to some degree in Tunisia right now. So the notion, you cannot understand political transition without understanding the notion of socio-economic redistribution. They go hand in hand, and you actually can have a correlation between inequality / justice injustice and success in consolidating political transition. You can have, and I try to do that later on in one of my slides. So that's Libya. So this is why the situation in Libya is the way it is, simply because the governments have not allowed civil society, they have not actually relied on the written constitution, have not wanted to set up a state bureaucracy in place so that it's not really dependent on the leader. So the leader has to be central to everything. And the moment that leader was removed, the country fell into chaos, complete, utter chaos in Libya. Right? So of course, the different trajectories, therefore, we can explain them through a number of reasons. I will focus specifically on three particular criteria, which I think are extremely important in the context of the Arab Spring. Namely, civil society, my primary area of interest, but also the role of certain key institutions, in particular the military, in some of these cases. Of course, as I said earlier, the linear approach to some of the predictive modeling in relation to political transition has been very limited. In many cases, did not really we cannot extract any explanatory power from them in the context of the Middle East for reasons that I've just mentioned. And I will elaborate on just in a minute. So, of course, firstly, there's completely different historical trajectories between Arab countries and Eastern European in particular. And the first one is really important. There's the lower, or very low, I should say, external incentives for democratization in the Arab world. Remember so let's explain that by referring to Eastern Europe, Central Europe. The West has a strong external incentive in democratization in those countries. The West actually wanted Central Europe to democratize because they saw that when they democratize, they will actually add value to some of their own visions and projects, thinking about Europe, enlarged Europe, expanded economic opportunities, etc. The West did not have the same incentive for the Arab world. As a matter of fact, it served the incentive economically not for the Arab world to engage on democratization, which is ironic. That's not what you hear publicly, but that's actually what drives those agendas. And of course, all of those things are linked to what we call now geopolitics. So really, geopolitically speaking, there is less of value in ensuring that those regimes undertake a proper democratic transition in the Arab world than there was either in South America or in post-Soviet Union, Central Eastern European countries. So, and that, again, is something that many theories of transition do not take into account properly. And it's one of the three criteria I try to use, which really leads us to some of those reductionist analytical frameworks, which are not very helpful. Yeah? And also very positivist and predeterministic in the way they try to account for these things. And you end up with highly descriptive, superficial statements on why things are happening or not happening in the world. So there's no, of course, neat causality. And what makes that neat causality very difficult to achieve is that if you want to follow the conceptual understanding of political transformation slash democratic consolidation, then normally you focus on also the macro and the meso level transitions. That is how interrelated changes in political, economic, and social spheres that slowly start moving in like tectonic plates, eventually creating the conditions conducive to those earth-shattering or monumental events. But that's not always the way we understood events in across the MENA region. So for me, really, the conceptual framing is very much around civil society, trying to be critical of Eurocentricity of this approach, those Orientalist depictions of the MENA region. Again, even the theory that we have is really suffers from the same limitations. And by extension, the notion of democratic consolidation, therefore, is a minimalist definition. And should not really be focused on the procedural manifestations of democracy. And we focus a lot on the procedural aspects of democracy. So elections held, there's talk of consensus, people are, so those procedural things are always not very helpful to a proper understanding. So what are the structural deficiency? And I'll try to be, I'll write all of them here and then So what are the structural deficiencies in the MENA region, which mean that the two processes, which is democratization but also consolidation of democratic gains, make them very, very difficult and highly problematic. So there are the underlying cumulative social and economic failures, and here I can talk for hours and hours. You don't want me to get into this because post-independence, nation building across the Arab Middle East, we had successive failures. We have successful flirting with different models of development, and all of them ended up in breakdown, divorce, so to speak. And really none of them has delivered. So from nationalism in the 60s, to some kind of flirting with Islamist ideologies in the 70s, to trying to open up on liberalizing economic policies in the 90s and the 2000s, but all of them have failed. Why have they failed? Because they were ill-suited to the local socio-demographic and economic realities of the Middle East. So in the end, what really ended up happening is this so-called Washington model, and I'm here quoting inverted commas because it was mentioned by a former director of the UNDP who works on the Arab world, and the name escapes me now, but invokes this Washington model. What it led to, rather than poverty reduction, is actually expanding, modernizing notions of poverty. So all of a sudden, for instance, middle class, which was really the strength of, say, Tunisian economy, Tunisian society, was 70–80% when I was growing up there, were actually classified as middle class, started to shrink. Why? Because these reforms, which were dictated to by international agencies, were telling them to do A, B, and C, like cut spending on social welfare, reform key social funds, minimize government expenditure. It's like really what we hear in Australia. But those economies are not really geared towards something like that. So that Washington model was really, in many ways, was doomed from day one, and therefore you create more pressure onto that social, the middle class, which becomes, of course, disillusioned with that process. And of course, what happens is then you see the gradual economic retreat of the state becomes also a gradual retreat of the state, politically speaking, because it started to lose legitimacy. People thought, okay, there's no democracy, at least there's a sense of welfare. At least there's a sense of security. But now there's no democracy, and we're losing what we thought we had previously, which is the bit of... And that really what ended up producing the conditions for the Arab Spring. In many ways, it's the combination of those two. And enduring political failure, which then became coupled with an emerging socioeconomic crisis. Rising unemployment among youth, in particular graduates, university graduates, that became the biggest challenge. And, of course, that has implications for all sorts of other problems. And, of course, one of the biggest neoliberal approaches to economic development assume a strong, vibrant private sector. Did we have a strong, vibrant private sector? Of course not. And the reason why there's no strong, vibrant private sector in terms of investment is because of corruption. You can't really expect people to come and invest and risk their capital if they think there's corruption. Like if you end up with a very profitable kind of enterprise, the son-in-law of the colonel or the president would come and wants that enterprise. If you found a new product through social entrepreneurship, there's no guarantee you can keep it because so-and-so would come and one really have a hostile takeover. So the conditions, structure were not there for this, and yet they were pursuing these neoliberal policies. Now, why Tunisia still managed some success? Because really it is quite unique in many ways, and I'll tell you more about Tunisia. So, which means this is why the outcomes in Libya, Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Yemen is so different. We cannot even lump them all in the same basket. There's no single, as well, there's no single Arab authoritarianism. We're very diverse in authoritarianism. We're very good at being creative in pursuing authoritarianism. There are all sorts of things where we fail, but Arab authoritarianism is very creative, has a resourceful capacity to be different in each and every setting. So let me now, after that broad-ranging discussion on some of the existing conceptual tools and the discourse on Arab Spring, talk a little bit about Tunisia, which is the subject of my research, has been for a while, and intensified since 2011. So this is what happens normally when there's a transition towards stable democratic governance. It's obviously the breakdown of authoritarianism, which is when Ben Ali left the country in 2011, on the 14th of Jan 2011. There's a transition phase, which actually took 3 years in Tunisia, until the elections of 2014. Then there's the onset of the democratization process, which is once they wrote the constitution and embarked on massive legislative and presidential elections. And that is meant to produce the stable democratic rule, yeah? But of course, we know that the path remains always rocky and difficult to predict, and with all sorts of interests clashing. I tried to, it's a still called a draft because I'm not really fully convinced it captures everything, but I tried to look at 3 neighboring countries, so Egypt, then Libya and Tunisia. They more or less exist in the same thing. And I wanted to focus on those 4 particular variables, right? So the role of civil society, role of the military institution, the nexus between religion and politics, and remember what I said earlier, the external incentive or influence, right? And then try to use that kind of analysis to see whether we can understand and maybe even predict outcomes. I don't think there's any predictive power, but it might be useful in terms of analysis, yeah? And what you notice is, and I think that's really, you look at Tunisia, there's pluses and, so the plus minus means it's 50-50, you know? There's a positive but also negative manifestations of that particular variable. So civil society in Tunisia is absolutely the rock bed of this transformation. Remember that the civil society quartet, which shepherded the I guess since 2013, when there's political assassinations and there was crisis, deep crisis, we could have ended up going the path of Egypt or maybe Libya, but no, it came back on track and produced a highly progressive constitution. All of that, they call it the national dialogue, was shepherded and led by the quartet of civil society organizations. So the unions, what we'd call here similar to the business council, and the lawyers union, and I think the doctors union. So basically unions and business council leaders got together and embarked on this national dialogue, which brought all the competing ideological opponents and managed to achieve a roadmap towards constitution and elections in 2014. And that's why they won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015, because what they did was nothing short of remarkable in terms of really steering a political process where you've got Islamists, you've got centrists, you've got secular, you've got extreme left-wing parties all really going against one another, but they managed to create that space for national dialogue, which produced in 2014 a very, I think a very important document in the Constitution, which then opened up the space for democratization. The role of military also in Tunisia, I'm putting plus, not because but because it has been historically apolitical. So the military institution in Tunisia has never really been in power, like even producing generals who become presidents. We don't have that history, but it remained apolitical. Even at the moment when there was no president, and there's a very strong general, Rashid Ammar, his name, who could have really, if he wanted to, grabbed power, but they resisted that temptation and remained very much protectors of the civil space. And they said, we can work with security forces, but we're not interested in getting into politics, which is of course not the case in the other case studies. And of course, more importantly, the military institution does not have economic interest in the economy. Unlike in Egypt, where the military institution controls more than 40% of the Egyptian economy. Not controls, but they actually own, which is crazy for a military institution to have that much economic power. The religion politics nexus is also extremely important. And what I mean by that is how do Islamists, regardless of whether we call them Muslim brothers or whether in Tunisia they don't want that association anymore, but how do they engage in local politics, and how are political opponents relating to Islamists, and the extent to which there is a possibility of coexistence, and the extent to which the Islamists are able to renounce some of what has been associated with them in terms of, we'll get to democracy, but once we empower, there's no democracy. You know that mantra, yes? So the Islamists are only interested in democracy till they get to power, but once they get to power, they no longer want democracy. So how do you manage to build that kind of rapport between Islamists and non-Islamists so that the country continues to function? Remember that in Tunisia, and in Egypt even higher, but in Tunisia, since even before the revolution, the Islamists had strong popular support. Like, it's always between 30 and 35%. It doesn't matter what you do, local elections, municipal elections, the Ennahda party, they always get about 30 to 35% of the votes. Which means you've got a strong party here, which is very viable, with strong popular support, which is not going to disappear. So the thing you have, really, which is more pragmatic, is how do you work with them? And how do they actually respond to the political impulses of the time? Because it's not enough to say, oh, but they just can't talk. But how? 5 minutes, right? Let me just start. And of course, the external influences, as I said earlier, in Tunisia was much lower than it is in, let's say, Libya, because of the resources in Libya, and even in Egypt because of the geopolitics of Egypt. So you look at that table, and I focus specifically on civil society and the military, and you can see why in Tunisia the outcome was okay. Because we are apparently only have 5 minutes. I can't believe I've been speaking for how many minutes now? 25. Unbelievable, no. So because of that, I will skip some of the other analytical stuff and focus on some data, because I think you would be interested in looking at data. Yeah. And what's really, out of all of this, what's really, really inspiring in Tunisia is the youth-led networks. And my projects recently have all been on youth, but the extent to which youth have been very active in this space. But unfortunately, it's also youth now present a big problem, structural problem, which, as the data will show in a minute. Let me go. So, what are the... So the reason why Tunisia has been held as an exception, if you like, or the Arab exception, is because now 7 years after the revolution, we had 1, 2, 3, we have 4 waves of elections, all certified as fair and credible. We had 1, 2, counting the presidents, 1, 2, 3, we had 4 presidents. The most recent, who is still in power now, has been elected in 2014 for a 5-year term. He's finishing in 2019. We had less stability in relation to governments, prime ministers. It's a kind of a system of governance which is a hybrid between the French and the Americans. So it's not presidential, but it's semi-presidential. You can call it like that. Yeah? So the president still has some powers, but the prime minister runs the show. And so that's created also some issues. But really what is still problematic is the elusive, what I say, the deep ideological reconciliation between Islamists and in particular, the Front National, which is the extreme left in Tunisia, basically, which used to be the Communist Party. Now they call themselves the National Front. And the National Front, basically, they despise the Islamists, and they refuse to work with them. So they still refuse, even though other centrist, other secular parties are happy to work with the Islamists, but not the extreme left parties, which are quite significant. They're the 3rd major political player in Tunisia now, after Ennahda and the central rightist, if you like, center-right, Nida party. The Front is the 3rd major political player, but they still do not want to have anything to do with another. And then, of course, what the problem that I will show you through data is the growing apathy and disengagement among youth in Tunisia. And this is the project that I'm doing, and I've been doing for a number of years now, through CAR grants. So this is data from this project, which was collected last year, and just a preliminary analysis. And I wanted to share with you their views on political civic engagement, like the attitudes, and also political engagement, I think the next one, and literacy, and then challenge to political engagement. So let me go to the first one. So this is really not a huge sample, but is as good as I can get, given the restrictions. So this is about 102 respondents. I did some folks interviews with some of them, and focus groups, but the actual survey is only 102. It's very difficult to collect, actually, because a lot of them don't even want to be having these discussions. But what you can see is, in terms of political engagement, the blue is the yes, of course, and the orange, red is the no, is they feel very much excluded from what I call formal political processes. Very few of them have played roles in government or community things. They do seem to be voting, at least the ones who we surveyed, which is quite high if you compare to the broader population. But really, a lot of their activities seem to be much more in terms of engaging youth organizations, and very few are members of political parties, 16%. But when it comes to voting, for some reason, a lot of them seem to be undertaking that part of the political process. But the next one is, oh, sorry. How can I go? Oh, there you go. This is really where I feel it's quite problematic, which is trust and literacy in relation to politics. So when you ask them, how do you rate your knowledge and experience in the democratic process, even though they rate that very highly, you ask them, how do you rate the level of engagement of Tunisian youth in general have in the country's political system, and then that jumps to almost 78%. And 15 youth, only 11% say that they have any satisfaction in relation to how they've been engaged with. That's really the biggest challenge I can see. And the third one, how do you rate the level of Tunisian youth trust in the country's political class and current leaders? You get 96% with low and satisfactory rating. Right, so this is really the biggest challenge, and I can see it too through the interviews, but this particular slide is very, very worrying indeed, extremely troublesome. Why? Because Tunisia has a very youthful demographics, and but also, and remember that the Arab Spring started with young people leading the protests, who had high expectations, in particular political economic, so economic improvement in particular in relation to employment, but also politically speaking, they wanted to be taken seriously. And they feel now that 7 years later, that's not really happening, and that's producing, and this figure is very similar to a lot of national surveys I've seen in Tunisia, conducted by opinion polls. So I'll read a lot of the opinion polls, similar to what we have here, and it's very much, yes, Sharon, thank you for reminding me. So, challenges to political engagement, and you can see here, in particular, what's worrying is the not enough political space, 64%, Tunisia's democratic transition in general, 86%, so they highlighted as, and exclusion, 68%. So the sense of being excluded, not being able to participate, is obviously presenting a lot of those challenges. This is from an opinion poll. It's not really. So just to conclude, and I don't have to read my conclusions to you, but it's clearly the case that yes, we do have a situation where, by and large, the Arab Spring has not delivered. Is that reinforcing the notion of Arab exceptionalism? The democracy deficit theory? Does it capture? Does it justify some of the predictions through transition theories? In my view, it doesn't either support or refute, but what it does is it highlights clearly the requisite conditions for two things, democratization, but also consolidating democracy. And I think in the case of Tunisia, yes, it's an exception, but it's an exception because of the very specific historical processes that Tunisia has witnessed since independence. Remember that in 1956, the first thing that Tunisia did, unlike all other Arab societies, was to legislate a kind of a civil rights code in the constitution, which formally abolished polygamy, made female education compulsory, introduced equal pay, allowed women to initiate divorce, introduced laws to allow access to contraceptions and abortion. This was in 1956. A lot of European countries did it later, much later than Tunisia. So by and large, the social history of Tunisia has produced a society that is probably the most capable of engaging with this kind of political transition successfully. And they have done that. And the evidence is the only country that managed to come out of this Arab Spring with any credibility. And still, we have the next year, 2019, the elections, presidential and legislative elections. And recently, in 2017, we had the municipal elections, which is the first time ever in the Arab world that there is proper decentralization of political power. So now local councils are elected, mayors are elected, and they have local power like we have in Australia, now the councils, which is completely new concept of decentralization that was conducted and introduced successfully. So on all of those fronts, it seems things are going very well. But, as I said earlier, the biggest challenge is how to overcome some of those same causes which led to the Arab Spring, in particular, inequalities, structural inequalities in the system. So not only in relation to demographics, but in relation to geographies. So we have disparities between regions. And the longer the notion of inequalities are maintained, the longer the challenge to democratization will persist. And on that note, optimistic, thank you very much for listening.
Now we have only a few minutes for Q&A. If there are any questions or comments on prospects of democracy, chapter of democracy, Tunisia. We have the expert on the podium. Now the chance to ask you questions. Yes, Samir.
Okay, you present a picture of Tunisia as being better than other Middle Eastern countries. So I'm just wondering- Different. But what explains the fact that there is a large number of foreign fighters that left Tunisia? What is that? What did that happen?
I mean, in many ways, I'm not very surprised by that. And the numbers are, proportionally higher. But so a lot of those young people, remember that since 1956 till 2011, so that's almost 60 years. For 60 years, there's been suffocation of anything to do with Islamists. Remember Bourguiba, the first president, was an ardent secular leader. So what he did is he almost blacklisted anything to do with Islamists. So if you are an Islamist, so you were in Tunisia, now we have freedom to wear, but before the revolution, you're not allowed to wear the headscarf. We're worse than France. So France, only recently, but in Tunisia, the headscarf was not allowed. Or if you wear it, was really taking a personal risk. For men to exhibit any notion of religiosity, you would be placed under surveillance. In many cases, you lose your job. So there was suffocation, and this goes back to civil society theories. The more you suffocate individuals and deny them public space to actually articulate and engage and mobilize and build solidarity, the more you are building pressure. Yeah? The moment there was a revolution in 2011, a lot of those people who held strong views about their religious identity all of a sudden wanted to go and do things. And of course, they were recruited. There were networks recruiting them, in particular in the southern Tunisia, where there is obviously disconnect with Tunis, the cosmopolitan city, and a lot of these people felt they're not getting anything, they're missing out. And there were people who were recruiting them very, very cleverly. You know, they're flying them out of Tunisia to Turkey and then on to Syria. So those two things really explain why we had large number. And of course, initially there were mistakes made too by the coalition, governing coalition. And those mistakes were, no, now we have freedom, anyone can do anything they want. And people were reporting to them that you have to be careful. We went to sermons in mosques, and they were talking about things like this, like jihad. And the government said, at the time, 2012, 13, but they're free. We have freedom now. We can only arrest them if they do something, And I think in many ways they regretted that later on. So the governing coalition of 2011, 2013, they regretted not being much more, strong in terms of how they looked at some of those activities. Of course, hindsight is a very good thing. At that time, what they felt, I remember that the governing coalition had Islamists in them. So they felt, well, we can't. It's no longer Ben Ali's Tunisia. People are free if they want to go to mosques, they want to attend sermons. As long as they're not doing illegal things, we don't really want to interfere too much. And once those numbers were starting to come through, that large numbers of people are leaving Tunisia, parents were reporting missing kids, people were calling their parents, I'm stuck in whatever, in between Turkey and Syria, then the government realized that there's a problem, and they started to deal with it. So,
okay, so we have more questions. I think I'll take two. Nasser, Firas, please.
Thank you, Fethi. I just wonder if there is any correlations, positive correlations between the factors that you listed there, like civil society, incapable, military, for example. If the strong civil society has some contribution to the fact that military is apolitical, or the political religious nexus has some contribution to getting from Islam civil society background in Tunisia. Is there a correlation between these factors?
Okay.
And I'll make a short comment as well, if you don't mind. The first chart that you showed about the data collection shows that there is a lower participation in the union and associations and all those things, the figures. I was wondering how it goes with our idea and the generally perceived idea that the civil society is very strong in Tunisia. Is there a
but these are the young people, not the young.
Let's take the second question as well, and then respond.
Sure. So,
Firas, please.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to write that down here. So okay. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Very rich presentation. Thank you for that. You started by critical of the Eurocentric conceptualization of the Middle East. But I find your conclusion that Tunisia was more European than Europe in the 50s is a bit contradicting, as if implying that Tunisia is the only success in the Arab world because it is as closer to Europe than anywhere in the Arab world.
Okay. Respond to those first?
Yes, please.
So let me start. That's an easy one. I wasn't actually saying Tunisia is more European than Europe. I'm saying some of the reforms, social reforms undertaken in Tunisia, which produced a strong, vibrant civil society, was so, in many ways, so progressive that some of them have not been achieved in Europe. Doesn't mean it's European, because even Bourguiba, the secular leader, he would not, and he was not willing to do certain things which would actually antagonize the religious identity of Tunisians. And there are a lot of examples of what Bourguiba restrained from doing, not to offend the notion of Tunisia's Islam. So Bourguiba looks at that in terms of Tunisia's Islam must be moderate and must be flexible, rather than we are copying Europe. So it's, in a way, for them that's a local national identity, which is at once Muslim, Arab, African, and Mediterranean. Because that's what it is, actually. And also, historically speaking, there was waves of European Turks and other civilizations which affected Tunisia. What I was referring to in relation to theory is copying a predictive theory which was applied to Central Europe and South America in relation to democratization, and try to use it across the Arab world. I'm just saying, not just Tunisia, across the Arab world, which of course we know that it cannot because of the different historical political trajectories of those three regions, South America, Central Europe, and MENA. And And you may well say that, well, Tunisia is an exception because what it exhibits is perhaps more European. I'm saying it's more progressive. That's all. I'm not labeling it as Western or Europe. I'm just saying it is more progressive socially. And that is a historical fact, actually. If you go back to 19th century, 18th century, there were things. First constitution was in Tunisia in the 18th century. Women's suffrage was granted in Tunisia during the Bey, the king, before the French even came in. So there's a history of, and that's the reformist movement in Tunisia, the Islamic reformist movement. There's great scholars like Tahir Haddad who wrote a very influential book, and I would advise anyone who wants to understand Tunisia, you know the book.
Absolutely.
Our Women Between Sharia and Modern Life. Read that book. Tahir Haddad, early 20th century scholar, and before him many scholars, to understand that it's not actually a recent westernization superficially, it's actually, there's a history, historical process of wanting to open up and reform, and it's a cumulative process. Now your question, so that, remember that this small sample, just over 100, is in relation to youth. And those youth now in so the survey was collected in 2017, the apathy is growing. So it's perhaps that now they've withdrawn from a lot of those activities. But I'm talking about a historical process of the strength of civil society. So that's probably where the contradiction would appear to you, but there's no contradiction really. It's just that right now there's a problem with youth in relation to political and economic issues. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, the second one.
What was the second one?
Correlations between the different factors, like
yeah, that's it. So maybe there's a relationship actually. Maybe because the military is apoliticized, it allowed civil society to be more vibrant. It may well be the case. I haven't looked at that. Whether there's I don't like the word correlation, because correlation means you have to set any kind of analysis which controls all the variables, and I cannot pretend to be able to do that. But there's certainly conditions which are conducive to civil society being more vibrant. And in Tunisia's case, it's the role of the UGTT, which is the national union body in Tunisia, which has a history of fighting colonialism. As a matter of fact, they produced very strong charismatic leaders from the 1930s, 40s. They're very well organized, structurally speaking. When we had dictatorship in Tunisia, the only true opposition was unions, not the cosmetic political parties. So the unions were the real, if you like, threat to government. So that goes really well before even independence. We had some very strong legacy there.
We are way over time, but I think it's important to keep the conversation going. If you don't mind cutting the morning tea by 15 minutes, we can have another 2 more questions. Would it be okay? So I'll have, okay, more than 2 questions. Oh.
Thank you, Professor. Great presentation. I just have a question on the economic transition, because I think the presentation covered the political transition very well. And I've had the opportunity to listen to the Tunisian Prime Minister earlier in the year speak at a conference in Morocco. And it sounded very familiar in terms of this sort of trickle-down economics and austerity measures, and the focus on macroeconomic growth. At the same time, we've seen in Tunis over the last 2 years lots of protests happening in socio-economically marginalized areas like Gafsa and so on. And historically, development has been happening in the north rather than the south. So I just want to reflect more on the economic transition and what are the chances for its success. And also on the statistic that I've read that actually corruption, according to Transparency International, has actually increased compared to Ben Ali's time, especially in light of the tahreeb, the smuggling that is happening on the Libyan border, and how the local authorities are actually benefiting from that smuggling. Thank you.
Yeah, good.
Okay, so let's take one more question. Since the mic is here,
It's damaged, I think.
please.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. It's really very, very interesting. You have mentioned the Islamists in Tunisia, or Muslim Brotherhood, or Nahda, Hizb al-Nahda. What has made Hizb al-Nahda or Muslim Brotherhood succeed in Tunisia and not succeed succeed in Egypt? And you have mentioned the political factor, you have mentioned the external influence, you have mentioned the military. And I do understand that there's no maybe strong Saudi role or Qatari role in Tunisia. But Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia are more welcoming to the opinion. They didn't suppress the protesters, for instance, but Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt suppressed the protesters. So what has made them different?
Questions? Well, the reason I didn't go into details because Shahan told me they have a lot of time, so we blame Shahan for that. But let me start with Adil's questions about economic transitions and trickle-down economics, and then the corruption. So, yes, I said this many times. I think the economic challenge, in particular unemployment, remains the biggest problem for the successive governments. Actually, we had 7 governments now, prime minister-led governments, and many of them have been removed because of a perception in the electorate that they have not delivered economically. No one is contesting the political transformation or the political process. Everyone is very much happy, and they see that the elections are transparent and fair, and so that's not the issue anymore in Tunisia. The constitution is consensus, everything is fine. When it comes to economics, and giving the high demands that the youth, in particular movement, has placed in this high premium on economic redistribution, it meant that not only they're not progressing, but actually they're going backward a little bit. Of course, because investment has been decreasing, tourism has been suffering, Then we have a key sector in Tunisia is phosphate and its derivatives production in that region, gaps that you mentioned. And phosphates and derivatives production has also shrunk because workers there are demanding better conditions, so they go on strikes all the time. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. For the country to move and make economic progress, you need things to come together. But because people also are wanting things to happen here and now, it's not really giving them what they want, and that leading to more protests and more problems with foreign investors who see, well, if there's instability in the labor market there, why would they go and invest more? If there's a lot of strikes, it's going to affect productivity, so why would you? So it's really become a kind of a vicious circle for successive governments, in fact, including the current prime minister. So that in itself, in my view, is much bigger a challenge than, let's say, the security concerns or the political process, the procedural elements of democracy. I see those ones are not challenged anymore because they've developed the tools and the capacity to do those quite successfully, as a matter of fact. That the corruption also remains a big problem. And the corruption actually takes me to what I said earlier in relation to the issue of, theoretically speaking, how inequalities and the degree of inequalities in society can actually tell you the extent to which genuine political transformation can happen. Because corruption is a manifestation of certain interests in the local economy which do not want to yield or give up on some of those economic interests. So the black market, the monopoly of certain sectors, the avoidance of paying taxes that everyone should pay. For instance, to give an example, and I was there last year, and there was a huge discussion in Tunisia on why aren't doctors and lawyers reporting their income. Therefore, they're not paying taxes. So the fiscal capacity of the government to raise revenues is really limited. And you can extend that to small businesses, like coffee shop owners or small retailers. A lot of them, they're not reporting their income properly, which means depriving the government of a lot of taxes that they can use to actually fund social programs. So there's a huge, huge challenge. They try to do it, like reform fiscally some of these issues, but of course, every time they try to reform a sector, you are faced by resistance by that very powerful lobby or unions or whatever, who say, well, no, why are you starting with us? Start with them. So that's creating an ongoing problem of both black market monopoly, if you like, but also depriving government of really much needed fiscal revenues, which they have been able to. They made some inroads, but not as much as they would have liked to. The Islamists and Nahda, why they've succeeded or they managed to do okay in Tunisia. Now, right now, Nahda do not want to be identified as Muslim Brotherhood. They actually had their National Congress earlier this year, I think, and the key manifesto that came out of that National Congress was essentially two things. One is we want to officially separate the preaching from the political. Say in Arabic, da'wi. We want to separate a da'wi from the political. So, Nahda may well have civil society organizations which do the da'wi, which is preaching and trying to, but they said that's no longer a formal part of the party, Nahda, which is a party, political party, which will only engage in politics. So they made this separation precisely to fend off any criticism that you cannot mix politics and religion. But of course, even though that came out as a resolution of their National Congress, their opponents don't believe them. Say, no, we don't believe you. You said that, but we don't believe you because the proof is in the pudding. And of course, they also distance themselves from Muslim brotherhoods, let's say in Egypt or the international, as you know, the Ulama Association of Islamic Scholars, because Nahda now seeing itself predominantly and almost exclusively as a civil, and they use the word civil, political party, which is actually kind of an oxymoron. Nahda is a civil political party, not religious. And they said, we separate the religious from the political, and therefore do not talk to us about religion anymore, but make us accountable for the politics and the policies that we come up with. And in many ways, their capacity, which is the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, their capacity to actually form alliances and engage in what they call consensus politics with partners who are really secular, in some cases extreme, aggressive secular parties, allowed them the space to actually be able to remain in power. They've been part of government since 2011 now, which is remarkable. And also, they've been very good in doing something which is it's more tactics than strategies, and that is never wanting to assume leadership of governments. So they had some prime ministers, but very short-lived, but they never wanted to nominate for the president's, for instance, election. They said, we're not interested in presidential elections. And now, for the last 2 or 3 governments, they did not want to nominate prime minister, even though they are the majority party, or not the majority, but the largest party, because they don't have more than 50% of the seats. But they are the party with the most, or the largest number of seats. So they said, we're not interested in political power as such, but we want to be part of the government and let others assume that. And their leader, Rashid Ghannouchi, has been asked many times if he wants to nominate for the presidential elections, and he still hasn't said yes to that. So he's still wanting to say, no, it's not something. He may well nominate, who knows, but so far he's resisting that.
Clearly, we can spend another hour easily talking about this case. Fascinating. Thanks so much for sharing your research findings with us, Professor Mansouri. Now it's time to have a quick morning tea, only 20 minutes. We'll convene again at 11 o'clock. We'll be splitting in 2 groups. So look at the program on the table, please, just to make sure which group you join. Thanks again.
Thank you, Shah.